Welcome back to Trauma in the Brain podcast. I'm Chantel Tilly Anderson. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Matt Laszlo. I am a licensed counselor in the state of Arizona. Started as a crisis counselor, moved into full-time counseling, and then ultimately became a clinical supervisor as well. So still really glad to be doing primarily therapy though.
Well, thanks, Matt. We're happy you're here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Today we're diving into something inescapable in the news and in our feeds: political violence, sensationalized media, radicalized groups, and how the images and stories of these events affect our brains and our bodies and the way we live our daily lives as Americans. We're going to jump right in, Matt.
Yep.
What does the term secondary trauma mean?
Yeah, well, I'll give the definition and then I'll kind of speak a little bit about how what has happened could sort of constitute both primary and secondary trauma. Secondary trauma, the simplest definition I could give would be when you start to experience symptoms of trauma through stories about somebody else's trauma, somebody telling you about what happened to them. Real common in the therapeutic world, it's called countertransference. If a therapist starts to experience trauma symptoms from working too closely with trauma, close friend, family member describing to you their experiences, and then you could potentially have nightmares about what they told you. Start to feel negatively, start to feel overwhelmed, start to blame yourself, start to have all the same experiences that they have. Essentially, it's any or all of the PTSD symptoms from a situation that you didn't directly experience. The most recent news that we would use as an example being a shooting on September 10th of this year, where thousands of people witnessed that. That's not secondary trauma for them. For them, that's primary trauma, even though they may or may not have had the perception that it was happening to them. Some people in that situation, especially those probably closest to the tent, may have experienced an extreme fight or flight response that they themselves were in danger, even though long after the fact, it would come out that they were not the target. There was a very specific target, right? Mm-hmm. That said, in that moment, your fight or flight system likely does not know that. So if anybody in that situation had the perception that they themselves were in danger, and it could certainly be argued that they were. If the plan was to hurt only one, that doesn't mean that everybody else there doesn't still feel fear and is in some level of danger. So primary trauma for anybody that experienced it directly. Secondary trauma would look like hearing about it from a friend, a family member, somebody that was there directly, but it could still very much lead to all the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. As we've talked about multiple times, and you'll hear me say over and over and over, trauma is anything that negatively affects our view of ourself, our view of the world, or both. Hearing about something like this can make you question, am I even safe? I use a case example for this one, obviously keeping it generic and protecting HIPAA. I met with somebody the day after that who was having severe anxiety, almost to the level of a panic attack. And this was in a brief session, not a standing patient of mine. So obviously had to do a little rapport building and kind of get some basic information at first. But I asked this person, what was the trigger? Well, they described the day before in hearing about what had happened. And I said, so what was the worst part about that for you? And what have you been experiencing since? And what the person said was, well, he was killed for no reason. So how do I know I'm not just going to get killed at any time? We processed that, obviously. And her experience of that was, I'm never safe. Not even having seen it or experienced it, but what was told, and then the core belief being that it happened for no reason, therefore I and everyone around me is constantly unsafe. So that can lend itself real well to trauma. Now, fortunately, when it comes up as early as it did for this person, literally the next day, we can kind of challenge that narrative, create some positive affirmations, even talk through it to where it doesn't have the dissociative experiences and there's a measure of closure, preventing it from becoming a long-term traumatic experience. So that's an example of secondary trauma.
So, what is going on or what happens in the brain and body when we see violence, even if it's secondhand?
Well, I think you get two very different experiences. When we see violence firsthand, it's an automatic fight or flight response. Anybody in that crowd would have experienced the fight or flight system almost fully activating. I suppose the further away maybe less, but let's say the people at the very front see things, and so their fight or flight system is fully going to activate. But then you put yourself 500 yards away, the screams that come through the crowd. You may not have been looking at the moment that happens, not seen it, but your fight or flight system immediately knows something is not okay. Something is wrong. And it immediately starts to question, am I safe? And typically, your fight or flight system will always err on the side of caution. So if it's an uncertainty, it says, no, we are not safe. And it will activate your fight or flight response. You start to breathe heavily, you start to tense up, you start very actively and aggressively visually scanning the situation. You see people running, you tend to start running, right? Quite a few comedians have done bits on that, which I always get a kick out of, start running and see who else runs. More often than not, obviously a lot of different ways you could go with that as a comedian, but as a counselor, what I typically tell people is your fight or flight system pokes its head up the second you see that, even if it's a social experiment or a joke or a prank, or unfortunately a situation like we're talking about now, a very real situation that you didn't directly see, witness, experience. Your fight or flight system goes off and then can slowly start to add more narratives. When it's secondhand, I think that a very different experience, and one that I think is worth noting. That said, somebody with more scientific research could certainly follow up on this and add to it. I'll give the practical clinical experiences that I've worked with. When you hear about something like this, there's immediately a measure of denial. And we'll talk about the stages of grief later. Somebody says, that a politician, a celebrity, somebody you don't directly know but you have knowledge of just died. Your brain says, is it even real? And I think that it's certainly made more problematic recently with all of the AI videos that people are posting. Things are being put out that by people that was not actually put out by them. They're even making fake videos of, Yeti spottings and things like that. And so I think that our brain immediately goes into some measure of deniability. That can't be right. A second thing that is a natural state, but I think one that we really as a society need to look at because while it exists as a protective reaction, it's dangerous. And that is to immediately justify it. Well, he did this, or she did have that stance, or that they did this terrible thing years ago, right? And that ties into what I process as the blame equals control equals shame model of processing. What I mean by that is if we can find something specific to blame it on, it makes us feel safer because it gives us a measure of control. Well, if he died because he was ... then all I have to do is not do that and I'm okay. If she was attacked because of her stance on ... then all I have to do is take a different stance and I'm okay. It's, like I said, certainly understandable. We don't want to judge or put anybody down for having that experience, but I think internally we really need to try to catch that as soon as it happens because what we're doing on some level is victim blaming. And that becomes a slippery slope that spirals out of control into such toxicity and poison. And then now we're just creating hate where hate already exists, like fighting fire with fire.
I recently had conversations with two people. They play different roles in my life.
Mm-hmm.
They live in different states. They've never met, but they're both close to me. And
Mm-hmm.
when everything happened, I reached out to them because I was trying to process it and talk about it because I didn't understand really what was going on or why what happened had happened. And they're polar opposites as far as their views.
Mm-hmm.
It was so jarring to hear both sides immediately jump to violent
Mm-hmm.
words
Right.
and just mean things. And I was just kind of taken aback.
Mm-hmm. Something, again, this is just from, oh, I don't know, you could almost call it empirical evidence, I suppose, observation, right? I don't know if there's research to support this, but why do people tend to jump to anger in a situation like this? Your fight, flight response, fight is an easy one in a situation like this where the threat is not imminent physical, meaning I'm on a computer right now. If you say something offensive to me or that my system perceives as dangerous, well, then my fight system activates and wants to put you down, berate you, belittle you, and all those kinds of things. Because if I can get you to acknowledge that you're wrong and I'm right, then I'm safe. And it feels a little easier to go into the fight system than the flight or the dissociative state, right? I'm not likely going to go into a dissociative state, you threatening me online when I know I'm in my kitchen and you're in your home somewhere else. So I think you do see a lot of anger and violence. And I think that we tend to villainize that and then say that anybody responding that way, it must be a bad person. Not that we ever want to justify it or excuse it, but I think if we can see it a little more empathetically as a fight or flight response, help the person calm that fight or flight response, and then we can start having those conversations again. And I think that, unfortunately, as much as we try to avoid controversial stances, that might be a controversial stance because the anger is justified. And I think that justified anger is still when it's the most important to calm our fight or flight systems and start having those rational conversations, regardless of which side it's on, which is why I like the way you put this together so much, not trying to push any agenda. I think that this needs to be a conversation that every political party, regardless of race, creed, culture, gender, or anything else, can get behind. So the another thing that can happen when we witness something traumatic secondhand is re-traumatization, traumatic associations. What that can look like is when you have a history of trauma, particularly unresolved trauma, anything that reminds you of it brings back that same response or worsens it sometimes. And a traumatic association is what I loosely call it. It's a reminder, right? It brings me back to that place. Um, Speaking of the fight or flight system, we can't do personal disclosure too much in counseling sessions, but in this situation, I can. And I thought I had an experience myself with what happened recently, and I thought I would talk about it because it paints a picture. I was trying to avoid the video, to be honest. I was not there. I didn't have any interest in seeing the video. I knew what had happened. And as an ex-military person, I kind of thought seeing that video was not going to do any kind of good for me. That said, it popped up in what I thought was a news feed scenario where it wouldn't be. And what I experienced instantly, so much so that it surprised me, even a therapist who's done a lot of work, was rage. It was the fight or flight system, fully activated fight, and no behavioral issues, right? If anybody's worried about me, I didn't, flip the table or anything like that, but I could feel it internally. It was wild. I have not experienced that in a long time. So, trying to practice what we preach. What would I tell a client right now? Something in the present is reminding you of your past. What's happening? When's the last time you felt like this? And what instantly came up was the last time I observed something that violent was in the military. It was during a military briefing when we're getting ready to go on a mission. So my fight or flight system says, oh, it's time to go. Working through that, preventing that from becoming traumatizing or being stuck in that anger phase looked like, no, you're not in the military. You haven't been for over 20 years at this point. Calm the fight system. You don't need the fight system. And so some relaxed breaths. But the biggest piece that I think a lot of people overlook when trying to calm their fight or flight system is some self-validation. Oh, okay, I know why this is happening because it reminds me of that time where once upon a time this mobilized you to go, run off into the night with body armor on. So your fight system says, okay, you need me. I need to tell it. Once upon a time we did. We don't right now. Thank you. A lot of people call that inner child work. If it was childhood stuff, telling your inner child, I don't need you to drive the car right now. This is real similar to when you used to have to drive the car, but right now we're okay. It's different. So I think traumatic associations, if you will, come up and it can trigger one specific system, fight, flight, or freeze, depending on what was most useful to you in that situation.
So I want you to describe more about the inner child. If you could just describe kind of what it means and how you approach it, your inner child, how you
Mm-hmm.
recommend other people do it.
Well, with the way you phrased that question, how do you deal with your inner child? Typically with kindness and empathy,
You don't
which
deal
we,
with them.
right, which is ironic because you would think that any child, that's how you should deal with them, right? But we don't, especially our inner child. We get mad at ourselves for getting mad. We tell ourselves it's stupid to feel sad for a celebrity. We tell ourselves it's ridiculous to be upset or whatever comes up, you know? And we need to dwell with kindness, love, and respect for our inner child. Of course, you're scared. This reminds you of a situation where you were powerless, out of control, and quite frankly, harmed. So thank you for waking up and reminding me that this situation is similar. But what you don't know is in the present, I'm okay. I am not in the army anymore. I don't have to go do those things that you had to go do. Or as a child, if it's much younger than that, you have to tell him or her, this is similar, but I'm an adult. I can set healthy boundaries. I can walk away. This is not directly happening to me. If I may, since you brought that topic up, I think it's a really great topic. Inner child work is pretty important in healing trauma work. Sigmund Freud, well over 100 years ago, pushed the age regression type work, meaning talking about what the experience was like for you at 7 years old, not in your adult, rational, logical mind. I think that so much of his subconscious age specific trauma work was so brilliant. And I think maybe we should have been chasing some of his other work much more in depth than we did. I think some of his most famous work isn't some of his, obviously, this is my opinion, but some of his most useful work. Age regression, every trauma survivor, particularly sexual abuse that I've ever worked with, if you ask them rationally in their logical mind, was it your fault? The number of times I have had the sentence word for word, well, logically, I know it wasn't. The number of times I've gotten that answer, right?
I know I did that before.
Yes. And I tell people all the time, I'm like, well, that's good that your logical mind knows that. If your emotional mind doesn't know that, you're not healed. We need to heal the inner child. We need to tell 7-year-old you, it's not your fault. There's nothing you can do to control this in the present, but you're going to be okay. Someday you're going to be 15, 25, 35, 45, whatever applies at the present moment. You will get there, and this is not your fault. That's when, and it not quite as simple as that, but once we start to do that kind of work, we get that moment where it's like, that actually feels true. It feels different. That's when we're starting to integrate new information, and a traumatic memory starts to actually become just a bad memory. When somebody can call you out on it or it comes up in some unexpected way and you don't panic because no part of you goes, it was my fault. In fact, not that it should ever happen, but because I'm a fan of Albert Ellis and he talked so much about don't let what anybody says to you affect you. We want to get to a place where even if somebody accuses us, what's the word I'm looking for? Quite frankly, it was your fault. You want your inner child and your adult self to be able to go, no, that's wrong. I know that. I've done the work. I've explored it. I've processed it. I've gone round and round with this. I've gone through the stages of grief. That doesn't affect me because I know it's not true. That takes a lot of work. And I tell people all the time, as much as I'm an Albert Ellis fan, I also subscribe a lot to feminist therapy that says wrong is wrong. And more often than not, things are a problem because of abuse, oppression, and those kind of things. So am I saying that anybody should say that ever? No. But unfortunately, the world we live in, they will. So we prepare ourselves for the worst, unfortunately.
So, in the past few weeks, Americans have been confronted with disturbing events of public violence. We've already kind of covered what happened. And we're not going to go into names or graphic details because we're not trying to sensationalize anything. However, we do want to acknowledge the reality. These events are happening, they're in our headlines, and they're shaping our daily lives. When violence enters the public sphere, it doesn't just affect the individuals directly involved, it ripples outwards exponentially. And as a nation, we carry that weight in our collective nervous system. Matt, can you explain how repeated exposure to these kinds of events impacts the American psyche on a broader level?
There's he talks about it in a book called The Comfort Crisis, and I can't remember the research that he cites. But essentially, what they've started looking at is, can our brains handle doom scrolling, everything wrong in the world that we now have access to on social media? And what's unequivocally coming up is no, we cannot. Our brains are not designed, our fight or flight system is not designed to prepare me for every dangerous thing in the world. It was only designed to prepare me for the dangers around me, real life, actually in my sphere, right? And so what we get with these kinds of things constantly flooding us. There was a shooting last week. I believe there was also a real pertinent stabbing. I think that was the same week. And the week before that, maybe not as big in the news media, people were stabbed, people got killed. There were car accidents, there were
There was,
diseases, the
there,
school shooting.
yeah, there was so many events that unfolded.
Right. Our fight or flight system is really taking the toll of that. And what I see as a clinician, and I think we will just continue to see on the rise, is diagnosable anxiety disorders. I struggle with that a little bit, though, because I hate just looking to diagnose something as opposed to looking at why is this happening and potentially intervening at the level of let's prevent this rather than treat it once it's there. Um, I talk to people a lot about anxiety is a sort of a managed healthcare term, right? Not necessarily a human experience, the way that we would say fear, sadness, disgust, and things like that are core emotions. Anxiety is not a core emotion. What I typically liken anxiety to is a fear of what if or unknowns, right? It's not present danger. If it's present danger, it's not anxiety, it's stress or fear. I always kind of jokingly tell people if your house is on fire, nobody would say you have anxiety because your fight or flight system is going off the rails. It's supposed to. But if I sit here and I wonder what would happen if my house caught on fire, now it sort of just moved into a realm of anxiety. Because these things keep being thrown in our face without ever present real danger, if you will, we get constant anxiety. So I haven't ridden on a subway in 25 years. But now I watch this thing or I hear about this stabbing on a subway, and I go on a subway, and what is my fight or flight system doing? It's waking up, right? Because it says, we heard there was a stabbing on a subway and we don't know a whole lot else about it. That's not good. Now, that sort of creates a catch-22 of the news, right? Some people say, well, that's why you got to be informed. Where was it? What was going on? And that kind of thing. So you can look for it. I think that's a dangerous precedence we're setting because blame equals control equals shame. We sometimes lie to ourselves and with the delusion of control that if I just know everything that's going on in the world, I'll never be unsafe. Well, that proves itself wrong over and over and over and over again. So yeah, we're seeing just a significant skyrocketing of anxiety as we do the what ifs. Could that happen to me? Am I safe? And the answer seems to be more and more and more no, but it's not a danger that we can actively do something about. That being a somewhat general statement, right? There are certain things that you can do in any given situation. So depending on where it's at, right? If the news talks about a killer on the loose in your community, well, then, yeah, of course, you should probably be on the lookout and things like that. Where I would still say differentiating anxiety from fear is, what if he comes to my house? Well, that's anxiety. That's not actually that helpful. Practical steps towards safety, keep your doors locked. I think everybody would recommend that at this point. And make sure you've got your cell phone so you can call the police if you happen to see the person. We're just being overwhelmed, and our fight or flight systems are having a real hard time differentiating present danger from potential danger or no danger at all. It's hyperactive and it's exhausting, and I think it's also leading to a lot of emotional, physical exhaustion for people. We're walking around terrified.
One of the biggest challenges today isn't just that the violence is happening. It's that we're in our comfortable, safe home space. We're looking at the internet, we're scrolling, whatever. And then those images are shown repeatedly without warning. I feel like it's like being involuntarily traumatized by it. That's kind of what happened
Mhm.
to me with the shooting last week. I didn't
Yeah.
realize what I was clicking on, and I watched it, and I I was affected. So when we're involuntarily traumatized by the internet with no one to hold accountable, I know for me, I often feel helpless or even weak because of my reaction to it. What advice do you have for someone who is going through similar thoughts and feelings? And how do we protect ourselves without being completely cut off from life and everyone?
I'll go a little bit different direction because I feel like we covered a lot of what I was going to say in the last one. But I think we start with what we talked about a minute ago. Never call yourself weak for having an emotional experience. Too often we tell ourselves it's weak, it's wrong, it's crazy. But I love to tell people, science, psychology, and religion don't agree very often. And when they do, you've typically got a profound truth. And all of them would say that nothing happens for no reason. There's some chain of events, right? Now it can be very much unknown to us. Science has account of a chaos theory, right? Religion has accounts for sometimes this causes that, but sometimes it doesn't. And the same with psychology. Our beliefs dictate what we see. So we've got to stop telling ourselves that emotions or feelings are wrong. They're not wrong. That said, what can be wrong is what's behind it, thoughts, an irrational thought. Now, an irrational thought, anytime I reference these, I always clarify what it means because that term has become weaponized, right? People say to each other, you're just being irrational. It's not meant as a weapon in rational emotive behavioral therapy or cognitive therapy. It typically means any thought that's unverifiable, I can't prove it, and or only serves to create misery. The second one being sort of the more problematic because too often people will say that it is verifiable even if it's not, but it feels verifiable, right? It was definitely my fault. Um, okay, but that thought is only creating misery in the present, so we're going to go ahead and challenge it anyways. So if we start there by normalizing our experience and then taking it a step further and saying, why am I having this response? Then we can actually figure it out and potentially do something about it to stop it. It's the irony of radical self-acceptance is telling yourself, knock it off, doesn't work. Acknowledging that it's happening and exploring it reduces it and maybe even stops it, even though you told yourself you don't have to stop it. So I think that's such a big place to start is radical self-acceptance. Whatever you're feeling is yours, but there's nothing wrong with exploring it, challenging it, and looking to heal from it. And it could be an opportunity, unfortunately. I say unfortunately because an opportunity that we don't want, but it can be an opportunity to heal something that we may have thought was healed. Like I said, I hadn't had an emotional reaction like that in years. And it came up and it was like, hey, go do a little more work around that. That said, where do healthy boundaries come in? I am very much of the opinion that no one should be showed these types of images against their will. I don't love that as a therapist. It just once upon a time, and I date myself a little bit with this. Once upon a time, the news only came on at 5 p.m. and 10 p.m., and you had to actively choose to watch it. You went and turned it on. It was not thrown in your face. It didn't pop up. It should be a choice. If somebody wants to see it and wants to understand the situation, they have that right. I think that there is a lot of validity to the media running these types of stories but it should be a person's choice. That said, again, Albert Ellis would say, prepare yourself, do the internal work for the awful situation where it might come up that you didn't have the say in it.
Thank you for that. Do you have any advice when getting into conversations or situations with other people that you can tell are experiencing some form of this? What we've talked about so far, maybe reactions, positive or negative, coping. How do you approach somebody directly? I know we've talked about this, but I want to stress it. How do you approach somebody that you care for and love when you have to be like, hey, I noticed this behavior. You should probably watch out for what you're saying?
So if we're challenging somebody on their reactions,
Yeah. When everything happened, there was celebration by one of those two individuals that I told you about. I was a little bit scared and taken aback because I didn't understand or recognize those words coming out of their mouth.
Okay, so if the reaction somebody has differs from ours, regardless of which side we're on, right? Keeping it neutral, meaning that they're celebrating when we don't want to celebrate or when they're mad and we want to celebrate. The way we should be responding to them is with empathy or, at a minimum, genuine curiosity. I teach my clinicians, counselors, I teach clients, I teach all kinds of people that empathy is when you truly get it. You've experienced it and you get it. Sometimes we don't. And typically in those situations when we don't get it, we get angry because one of two things. Our brain says either you're right and I'm wrong, or I'm right and you're wrong. And whoever's wrong is despicable, awful, terrible, and horrible. Now we've opened the door to hate and all kinds of things that we don't really want. So genuine curiosity says, I'm not having the experience you're having. Why are you having that? Now, I'll go right into why people don't tend to do that. It's because, oh, so I'm just supposed to excuse it. I'm supposed to try to learn about their situation. They're not learning about mine. Not necessarily. No, I'm not saying excuse the behavior that you feel is wrong. But with genuine curiosity, we can sometimes understand it. And what we're looking for is misinformation or something that we can help them see is unhealthy. Then if we do that in an open, vulnerable way, they're much likely to change. If we do it in an aggressive way, telling them they're wrong, even if they are, it doesn't work. Brene Brown, Tali Sharot, both have done research on this. Brene Brown, obviously open, vulnerable, right? That's sort of her thing. I love her for it too. I tell people, how can she write so many books on the same topics? Yeah. And I know each one of them has new stuff, right? They're great because it needs to be said over and over and over and over again. Open, vulnerable. When you say to somebody, wow, that really hurt my feelings. Wow, that scares me that you would say that. That makes me really uncomfortable. It tends to trigger their sympathetic brain to go, why? I'm right. It can't possibly be hurtful. Yeah, but it is. There's another really good podcast. I wish I could give it its due credit. I can't think of it. But there was a young girl that was in the Westboro Baptist Church for years. And if you know them, you know their stances on things. But what she talks about is how she got out of that and how she would have these conversations with people where they would just fight. They would call her every nasty name and she'd call them every nasty name right back. She said, well, I was so full of hate. And she said, I loved it when somebody hated me because I was right. It just showed that they were wicked and evil and I could do what I was doing. She said, but it was an open, vulnerable response from somebody that's really hurtful. I wonder if you've considered what it's like being on the other end of that sort of sent her down this pretty, well, not pretty healing, extremely healing experience where she went, wow, hate is not the right answer here. I've got to move away from this. And if you're not familiar with them, moving away from that for her was a huge experience, a huge challenge, because it basically meant losing everybody in her life, family, friends. She was surrounded with very like-minded people, obviously. And so it was a huge endeavor for her to step away from that. And now she gives these talks on how it was open, vulnerable communication that won her over. After a tragedy of any side, the last thing that's going to help move anything along is hate. When we're mean and aggressive about people's views and opinions and feelings, then all we do is mentally shut them down. If we get curious, if we get empathetic, we can have those conversations. I tell people all the time, just because you're kind, empathetic, and curious about the other person's views, experiences, and opinions doesn't mean you ultimately have to change yours. People are so scared that, well, if I'm right, I shouldn't be having those conversations. Well, you do, because it's how we actually start seeing what's right and find common ground again.
When we talk about trauma, we often think of sudden events, violence, accidents, or disasters. Grief is its own form of trauma. It's the emotional injury that comes from losing someone or something deeply important to us. Grief shakes our sense of safety and control, just like trauma does. It affects the brain, the body, and the way we move through the world. In that sense, grief is a type of trauma, one that every person will face at some point in life. Can you walk us through what the process of grief looks like, what it is? How do the five stages work?
I can. And I actually sent you a visual. It's called The Stages of Grief. Depending on what listeners have researched or read, there's 5 stages, or some newer literature has 7. I'll talk about it for just a second and then I'll show it. Some research literature on grief does 7 stages. I've always just done the 5. I think it's so much simpler and more straightforward. Although I sometimes do a 6th that is not an actual stage of the grieving process, but I think it's important to highlight. Let me try to screen. Can you see this diagram? I came up with this working with grief because I really like this. I think it speaks to the experience for a lot of people. It's just easy to remember, right? So your 5 stages of grief are shock and denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and acceptance. I don't use depression. I don't like that because I don't think it should be called depression when a person's grieving. They're sad. That's an absolutely accurate emotional experience. I don't know. That's a side tangent point, but if you want to call it depression, certainly you can. I just don't like to for various reasons. Um, the reason I draw it this way is all the research and literature shows the stages are not linear. And I don't know that anybody would not agree on that. It's pretty standard. That said, shock and denial, pretty typically the first stage, then acceptance always being the last. So I draw it this way, somewhat linear. I call the middle 3, I talk to my patients about this is the whirlpool of the middle 3. Because once you step off the bank of shock and denial, it's like being tossed into a river. You get beat around pretty hard. Bargaining looks like shoulda, woulda, couldas. If only he had stopped smoking. If only she hadn't gone out that night. If only he had done specific treatment, right? We come up with all these explanations. And depending on where those irrational thoughts, which is what they are directed, we can often get anger, right? It's his fault. It's their fault. If only the doctor had, if only he had, if only she had. And then we get angry at them. But anger is sometimes an uncomfortable emotion. So the brain, looking to minimize pain, jumps from one to another. If you're getting smashed around in a river trying not to drown, you'll grab a hold of whatever log comes floating up. The sadness phase for me is when we've doing the shoulda, woulda, couldas anymore. We've acknowledged that none of that's helpful. Some of it might be true, though it's certainly unverifiable because it exists only in the past. And we've acknowledged the anger and we've done the anger, and we're realizing that's not helpful either. And we let the sadness start to come over us. That looks like creating a human experience. If what we're talking about is political violence, not specific to us, can we humanize the person again? I listened to a song specific to what happened on the 10th. The author said, "You didn't kill a villain. You didn't kill the evil it represents. You killed a husband and a father." And I thought, boy, that hits hard. That's intense. Because regardless of what their stance on things is, they're still a human being. And when we acknowledge that, we get sad. It can be a weird experience to get sad for the other guy, the other team. Oh, you shouldn't feel that way. They were bad people. I disagree with that. I'm sorry. The second we stop feeling sad for sad situations, all we're left with is the other two stages, the bargaining and the anger. That's not good. We can't be cutting ourselves off from normal, healthy, restorative, healing emotions. Yes, we can be sad. It does not matter what the political stance they held was, what their view on the political topic was, right? You get all these controversial topics. Every 4 years they change, but they kind of circle back around. The second we allow ourselves to feel sadness for them, we start to heal. I always draw it this way, with sadness being closer to the acceptance phase, because that being the most raw, true emotion associated with grief. So when we allow ourselves that in a deep personal way, then we're moving into the acceptance phase. Where I think a big topic needs to be addressed and could be a podcast all its own. So we'll go with it for a few minutes, and then it's up to you how long we stay with it or if we come back to it. Is oftentimes coming out of the anger phase of the grieving process is forgiveness. It's a topic that no one wants to address this early on. I think it's a topic that needs to be addressed almost immediately. And even when I work with trauma survivors of horrible abuses, I tell them pretty early on, no pressure, don't worry, don't not come back. But at some point, we're going to talk about forgiveness. Has that come up for you at all in your healing journey? And I've gotten a whole lot of F no's. I've gotten some yes, but I'm not ready. I've gotten some why would I's, every answer imaginable. And when it's F no, fair enough, we're not going there yet. But I've never worked with a trauma survivor that forgiveness was not a topic for a fair amount of time. And forgiveness is a bigger topic than just saying I forgive you for what you did. I really love the Wellbriety movement, White Bison. It's a trauma recovery program for Native Americans. I went to a training by them two years ago, I believe. It was called Mending Broken Hearts. And they have what they call the 4 directions of healing, which I have used ever since, and not just with Native Americans. I think this trauma forgiveness stuff goes across all cultures. I think it's a very human experience. What they talk about in that is basic forgiveness, the little stuff. I forgive you for not noticing that I was hurting, forgiving the unforgivable, sexual abuse, murder, the things that we typically describe as forgiving, as unforgivable. Forgiveness of self, which is typically by far the hardest one. Nobody wants to talk about that one, typically because they need to. And then forgiveness of others. What that might look like is, did somebody help? Did somebody cover it up? And those kinds of things. We typically need to forgive all of that in order to heal. And what I tell people is, before we actually go looking into that, keep in mind 2 or 3 very, very important things. Forgiveness is not condoning the act itself. It's not. If we were condoning it, it wouldn't be forgiveness, because you don't forgive that which isn't wrong. Forgiveness literally is saying it was wrong. We are not condoning abuse, violence, murder, anything like that. The second thing is, forgiveness doesn't mean I have to let the person back in my life. If we're talking about active, ongoing abuse, yes, I work to forgive immediately because it's better for my physical health, my mental health, but it doesn't mean I don't also set up boundaries. And the third one is, forgiveness often feels like minimizing it, and now I have to move on, or, what won't that create more bad behavior? It makes logical sense that it would, but again, I think science, psychology, and religion would all agree that positive motivation works better than negative motivation. Forgiveness promotes good behaviors. It promotes healing and restoration, whether it's of the self, the relationship, or both. But first and foremost, it's how I heal myself.
One of the most important lessons I ever learned was that
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Well, thank you for bringing that subject up.
Hmm.
We should delve deeper into it. Thank you for your guidance so far. I think what we'll do is record another episode soon
Okay.
about um, forgiveness because that would be important.
Unfortunately, it's an ongoing thing that
Yeah.
we've needed for a very long time and we will need for a very long time. So, yeah.
Thank you, Matt, for the guidance and information.
Mhm.
Trauma in the Brain is currently evolving into more support, more questions answered, a podcast, and hopefully a new website soon. Follow us on socials and show your support via Ko-Fi page at ko-fi.com/trauma and the brain. Today's conversation was heavy, but it was important. And when we understand how trauma affects the brain and the body, we're not just naming our reactions. We're learning how to move forward with confidence, empathy, and hope for ourselves, for our neighbors, and for our nation.